Thank you very much, Patricia, and thank you to the directors for this invitation. Speaking in the cathedral to this conference is a moving experience. It's a long time since I have spoken at a Patristics conference, because for the last 5 conferences, I was a director, and in general, directors don't take up space by giving papers. For all that time, and for much longer, the constant has been Mark Edwards as Betsy Livingston's helper, and then as her successor. We owe him a great debt. I remember, yes. I remember Mark as an exceptionally bright young research fellow who had almost decided that there weren't going to be any academic jobs and he'd better retrain. What a good thing that he didn't, though probably the job that he does now involves quite a lot of other activities. There are still too few academic jobs. But there are still new generations of graduate students and early career researchers, despite pandemic and wars, visas and finance. It's encouraging to remember that this conference began as a small gathering here at Christ Church in 1951, in the aftermath of the Second World War. It's also encouraging to remember the many beloved presences who have gone before. We've commemorated Elizabeth Livingston and Callistos Ware. Here, I think especially of a former dean of this cathedral, Henry Chadwick, and of a story that Eamon Duffy told when Henry's memorial tablet was unveiled in Westminster Abbey. At an ecumenical meeting in Venice, it was so hot that Henry collapsed. He regained consciousness to find the concerned faces of his colleagues gazing down at him. "Ah," he said, "I see I am not in heaven." But here on earth, peregrini, away from our true home in heaven, where would we be without the colleagues? Without their different traditions and perspectives, their different approaches to patristics, their shared commitment, even as they debate what patristics should be and what it should be called. Peregrini, away from our true home in heaven. I'm quoting, of course, from Augustine, De Civitate Dei, City of God. To be exact, I'm interpreting rather than quoting, by taking peregrinus in the sense Augustine knew, in the classical texts he studied, in Latin translations of Christian scripture, in Roman law. A peregrinus is away from home, perhaps traveling for interest and pleasure, perhaps forced into exile, perhaps a visiting foreigner, in law, a resident alien. Augustine had experience of traveling away from home and of meeting displaced people. He wasn't a resident alien when he lived in Italy. Italian refugees from Alaric the Goth were not aliens when they arrived in Africa. They may have felt foreign and wanted to go home, but they were all Roman citizens living under the same laws. Peregrinus in City of God has often been interpreted in its later sense, pilgrim, someone traveling to a longed-for destination which will transform their lives. Pilgrimage was becoming more common in Augustine's time, but he didn't see the point, because God is everywhere. It may also be a factor that he really did not like traveling. The pilgrim church, traveling onward in company, is a powerful image. But in City of God, peregrinus and its cognates carry their classical meaning. So the peregrina civitas of the City of God is a community away from home. And a civitas has its Roman sense of a community of citizens. It's not like the little walled towns shown on medieval manuscripts, or like the sprawling urban environments in which more than half of the world's population now lives. The City of God, in Augustine's understanding, is the community of all rational beings, angels as well as humans, in all times and places, who love God rather than themselves. And that is an example of commentary on the City of God. Commentary on the language of the Latin text becomes commentary on the Civitas Dei in this mortal life. And I want to talk this evening about this practice of commentary on texts. The program of this conference shows how very strong a presence Augustine continues to be, occupying the South schools every morning and several other slots on the program. Perhaps it shows how very useful he is as a starting point for papers. The program also shows how much of our work in patristics is the discussion, the interpretation of texts, which is not surprising. Texts are what we have. We are making progress on the context of material culture. Perhaps through cognitive studies, we're making some progress on the experience of the people who read or heard. In all this discussion of texts, is there something distinctive about commentary? The example I've just offered on the meaning of peregrinus takes Augustine as a man of his time, whose education rested on the correct use of classical Latin, written and spoken, as it was exemplified in a limited range of texts from about 500 years earlier. So, let's begin with Henri-Irénée Marot, who was so influential in establishing the late or antique Augustine. And let's return to 1951, in which this conference began. That year also saw the Congrès International Augustinien in Paris. The third volume of its Acts, Augustine's Magister, has a session on the theology of history, in which Marot saw an immediate need for un commentaire vraiment scientifique on City of God. Now, what did he mean by scientifique? English has lost sciences humaines. One of the problems for the humanities in this country is that science means only one kind of knowledge, natural science. The directors of this conference are not called the scientific chairs. Marot envisaged a commentary book by book and line by line, in the tradition of those great scholarly editions of the classics. It would need, he said, to be philological and to be concerned with rhetoric as well as language. Moving from words to things, it should study facts, sources, and ideas. I wonder how much Marot knew about the work which must then have been in progress by Gustave Party and his colleagues for the Bibliothèque Augustinienne. That edition of De Civitate Dei, in 5 volumes, follows the series pattern of the Latin text with notes of major variants, French translation, modest annotation, supplemented by impressive notes complémentaires. It expects an audience which wants to understand classical references, but is more concerned with the distinctive theological contribution of the great Saint Augustine. So here at once are central questions about commentary. Who writes it? For whom? What do they think their readers already know or want to know? Commentary on City of God would need to be collaborative, Marou said, and he offered to make a start the following year with Book 19. An excellent choice, for of all 22 books of City of God, that is surely the most read and most discussed. Did Marou make a start? Augustine would not be surprised by the challenges which hamper any attempt at commentary, whether collaborative or individual. City of God took a very long time to write, for reasons which are only too familiar. Workload, health, events, other people's commitments, delayed letter carriers, documents in need of correction, problems which are replicated these days by computer updates. And there was always the more urgent deadline. Among the letters of Augustine is one from the year 419, when he had been working on City of God for about 6 years. By 417, he'd finished the first 10 books against those who think that many gods should be worshipped, and had continued without a break to the second part, in which he would set out Christian beliefs. And at the end of Book 1, he'd committed himself to discussing the origins, course, and due ends of the 2 cities. He assumed that his audience knew what the 2 cities were. So by 419, Augustine had finished 4 more books, 11 to 14, on the origins of the 2 cities, ending Book 14 with a much-needed definition. The heavenly city is of those who love God rather than themselves, the earthly city of those who love themselves rather than God. Now, as this swift sequence shows, Augustine had the resources to make rapid progress. He had notarii to take dictation, to check references, to produce fair copy for correction. He could use work he'd done before. In Book 11, for example, he can use work on time, on the Trinity, on the interpretation of Genesis against the Manichaeans, but still a problem. This letter of 419 to his friend Fastidius triumphantly lists the backlog he had cleared when he came back from meetings in Cardiff. And my goodness, what a lovely idea, when he came back from meetings in Carthage. But then I was preparing to return to the books De Civitate Dei when suddenly there arrived letters. So instead, he had to compose more responses on the soul and its origin. They did come in useful, these responses, but it did mean that the City of God was interrupted for a while. Now, in preparation for his return to the books De Civitate Dei, Augustine had been making notes, quaestiones, on relevant books of Scripture. The next 4 books, 15 to 18, were to deal with the course of the 2 cities. that is, with their history in this world. These questiones are sometimes called the first commentary on the Heptateuch, the first 7 books of canonical scripture, but that was not the intention. Augustine noted in Retractationes that he would have continued to the books of Kings. The questiones would then have covered the historical books of the Old Testament, from the Law to the Prophets. And those historical books were the obvious source for the course of the city of God, which Augustine equated with the history of biblical Israel, and they also supplied some references to the course of the earthly city, whenever another earthly power impinged upon Israel and Judah. The Chronicle of Eusebius demonstrated the greatest extent of time that was attested in Scripture before any other history, Greek or non-Greek, became known. Augustine had long since had this chronicle in Jerome's Latin translation. He may not have known the calculation that 2,242 years from Adam to Abraham elapsed before there was any other recorded history. But he did acknowledge at the start of Book 18 that he'd followed the course of the 2 cities in Book 15, from the first human being to the flood, and in Book 16, from the flood to Abraham. But in the rest of Book 16 and in all of Book 17, so from Abraham to the coming of Christ in the flesh, he was concerned only with the city of God. That is, for the time period after Adam to Abraham, for which there were sources other than Scripture, he had continued to be engaged with scriptural exegesis. Now, the connection with commentary is that without these books of City of God, without the need to consider the history of biblical Israel in the course of the 2 cities, Augustine probably would not have asked his questiones as notes in preparation. To some books of Scripture, he constantly returned: Genesis, Psalms, some letters of Paul. Others he hardly mentioned. And since there wasn't any sign of a common lectionary, he rarely had to preach on readings for the day that he hadn't himself selected for his congregation. Commentary began as commentarii, notes on the text in preparation for teaching. In Augustine's early experience as a student and teacher of literature at Grammaticus, commentary provided notes for teaching a particular kind of student. Education was almost always for those who could afford to pay. Usually, they were young men from a social elite who would go on to take their place in their cities or in the imperial civil service. The classics of literature trained them in the correct use of language and the techniques of rhetoric. References to these classics in writing or in speaking signaled educational and social level. Education required a teacher, or the voice of a teacher in commentarii. Teachers themselves needed commentaries, their own and others. And that applied also to the study of Christian scripture. In one of his earliest surviving works, Augustine challenged people who thought they could say of Scripture, "I read it and saw for myself what it meant." If they weren't trained to read poetry, would they attempt a treatise on meter without a teacher? Asper, Cornutus, Donatus, and many others are needed for the understanding of any poet whose work wins applause in the theatre, which is an interesting implicit contrast between the theatre audience which assumed it understood and those who gave serious attention to the text. Similarly, in the preface to De Doctrina Christiana, Augustine reminded those who thought they could understand Scripture for themselves by divine gift that people need teachers. But there is a difference between those who expected commentaries or ought to expect them and those who simply by coming to church had free access to teaching, regardless of social and educational status, gender, and age. Augustine was very well aware that preaching required a different approach from teaching. City of God assumes an audience who were taught with commentaries. Augustine described in an early work reading Virgil with students, ensuring first that the available text was correct, and then working through it with explanations of language and allusions, sometimes giving a tractatio, a longer discourse on some important question. Augustine the grammarian can be seen at work in City of God. He rarely there notes textual divergences in Scripture, because he doesn't usually need to ask whether he has the correct text. Maybe some figures, especially to do with Melchizedek, there is a question about the text. But he is always alert to language, especially to scriptural ways of speaking. He'd paired those quaestiones on the Heptitude with a list of locutiones, ways of speaking derived from Greek or Hebrew, which differ from everyday Latin. And this concern with our way of speaking, ordinary way of speaking, as distinct from scriptural ways, appears very often in City of God. And in Book 2, he notes that res publica is in general use, but it's perhaps too far removed from our way of speaking for us to talk of the res publica Christi. We know that true justice is to be found in the civitas Dei. He will come back to that, of course. In Book 11, he explains that when Scripture says that God rested on the seventh day, this cannot be because God was tired after 6 days of speaking creation. You can see an experienced preacher there. So, he explains, the Lord's rest means the rest of those who rest in the Lord, just as the happy house means the happiness of those in the house. And that is an instance of the container for the thing contained, as in the theatre applauds. It is also an instance of that which effects for that which is effected, as in a happy letter. You get the impression he could go on giving several examples here. There's another case which concludes a long discussion of dying and death, and of the paradox that someone who is dying is still alive. It is somehow appropriate, Augustine thinks, that grammarians cannot decline the word moritor, he dies, in accordance with the usual rule. Oritor, he rises, has the past form ortus est, he is risen. But for moritor, the past form is mortuus est, and mortuus is an adjective. The verb form cannot be declined, just as death cannot be declined. He enjoyed that. So that is one way of doing commentary on a text. Other ways depend on the envisaged audience, the reasons for writing. Mid-4th century commentaries on some letters of Paul are evidence that the text was being read in Latin translation by people who were used to having a commentary. But they show a whole range of motives for writing it, maybe to engage in debate on whether Peter and Paul staged their disagreement at Antioch, on the grace of God, on the nature of the Trinity. You could compile interpretations in a variorum commentary. You may remember that Jerome found it rather disconcerting that when he'd done this, his patron Paul wanted to know, well, which one did he think was right? And he had no intention of answering that question. A commentary could give extensive theological discussion, seeking to reconcile apparent conflicts in Scripture, or to resist other interpretations, in the same way that Platonists used commentary to continue debate on the interpretation of Plato and Aristotle. So what does a commentator need to do other than confirming the text? City of God has been called an encyclopedia of Augustine's thought. Well, it isn't quite that, unless it was the only work of Augustine that you had. You might not in general use it as a starting point or as an obvious source, but of course for many centuries it often was the only available work. There is important research in progress on the quite remarkable number of copies, including partial copies and experts. It's not an encyclopedia, but it is a very wide learning experience. And so, over the centuries, City of God has attracted commentary, even though it wasn't actually a university set text. It's a remarkable fact that though Augustine was such an authoritative presence in the medieval period, the books weren't actually on the official curriculum. There are only 3 that seem to have attracted commentary: City of God and Confessions and De Trinitate. Now, Mahou thought that the kind of commentary he wanted, book by book and line by line, had not been done since the 16th century, when Erasmus conditioned Juan Luis Vives to contribute a text of De Civitate Dei with commentary to his new edition of the complete works of Augustine. This was meant to improve on Amerbach, who in 1489 printed De Civitate Dei cum commento. Now, part of that commentary is actually the earliest known, or emphasis known, although there was some before. In the early 14th century, Nicholas Trevet, who I'm glad to say was a Somerset man, and a Dominican who'd studied at Oxford and Paris, gave one of the classic reasons for writing commentary. Someone had asked for help. Well, perhaps they had, but there's actually a new book on Trevet's efforts to promote one of his other commentaries on Jerome's Latin translation of the Psalms. So there are other factors than people really needed help. Trevet had experience of writing commentaries on classical texts, on Livy and Seneca and Boethius. He explained author, place, date, subject, purpose, and then, as he went through the text, grammar and allusions. So for City of God, he knew what was needed. There's actually a manuscript from Merton College along the road, which is headed, "Here begins the exposition of foreign histories and poetic sayings," alluded to by St. Augustine in De Civitate Dei. That's where the help was needed. Trevet's Dominican brothers knew Scripture, but were likely to have problems in books 1 to 10, where Augustine deals with the authorities who are respected by his opponents, and in book 18, which begins with a very rapid catch-up on the history of the earthly city. Trevet's commentary on books 1 to 10, by the way, was superseded by Thomas Wallace, who had access to better classical resources until he was imprisoned in an unfortunate disagreement about the nature of the beatific vision. This is one of the less usual obstacles to getting your commentary done. So Trevet continued to be the authority on books 11 to 22. Now, when Vives was commissioned to produce a new text and commentary, he had moved from Spain to Paris and thence to the Low Countries, where he was licensed to lecture at Louvain. The Dominicans on the faculty, he said, told him that his work was redundant because Trevet and Wallace and one Passavanti had done all that was needed. Vives responded by listing their mistakes. Another classic reason for those great classical commentaries is the insufficient learning of earlier classicists. Vives is notable among commentators in that he actually took much less time than Augustine had taken to write City of God. He finished in 18 months because Erasmus had kept up the pressure to the point, said Vives, of causing a nervous breakdown. He wished he had given himself more time because City of God is so long and so diverse. When he'd finished book 7, which is on Roman religious cult, he expected the rest to take less work, except for books 8 to 10 on Platonism and, of course, book 18. These subjects were less familiar to theologians, Vives thought, but much other material is obvious. He could aim at brevity, because stories from Scripture are well known, and without brevity, there would be no end to theological debate. But still, it took time. Vives was not an immediate bestseller. The new edition was published in 1522, but apparently the publisher, Froben of Bâle, could not sell a single copy at the book fair at Frankfurt. But there was a reward, because Erasmus was a friend of Thomas More, who was then advisor to King Henry VIII of England. And in 1523, Vives became a fellow of the new and progressive Corpus Christi College, next door to Christ Church, founded in 1517 with a particular concern for the study of Greek. In his dedicatory letter to King Henry, Vives called City of God a treasure house of learning. And so it was for people who had limited access to other texts, especially to Platonist texts. But one of the effects of reading book by book and line by line is the realization that this treasury is quite modest, especially in books 1 to 10. Augustine exploits a limited range of texts, some in Latin translation, from which very small extracts are insistently used. In some, though not all cases, we have the complete text of his translated work. And this, in turn, demonstrates the problems that can result from taking a quotation out of its context, even if it's a quotation from Augustine. Now, I must have a mouthful of water before giving you one final example of an unlikely commentary. So after many more years of commentaries, reprints, updates, one final example raises further questions about the writing of commentary. A century ago, in 1924, J.E.C. Weldon published a 2-volume commentary on City of God. He had started it 20 years earlier as a canon of Westminster. He'd then already been headmaster of Harrow School, Bishop of Calcutta in its colonial spelling. His later experience as Dean of Manchester prompted an appendix to his commentary, contrasting Augustine's attacks on the theatre with the far more sensible attitude of the Church of England. He finished his commentary as Dean of Durham, not on very good terms with his bishop. Now, Weldon was a very well-trained classicist who'd worked especially on Aristotle. His envisaged audience was familiar with scripture and with theological debates. The commentary is, strictly speaking, an English language commentary, but he saw no need to translate the Latin, Greek, and Hebrew cited in the footnotes. Weldon's tone is rather of its time. The text, he noted, does not lie open to serious ambiguity, except perhaps in half a dozen passages, and Hoffman's Apparatus Criticus is pretty well exhaustive. That's the 1898 CSEL edition. More impressively, at least, he said, I may claim to have read all the writings of Augustine and to have verified all the references which I have made to him and to other ancient authors, whether classical or Christian. Many university libraries have a copy of Weldon, but it's usually not now on the open shelves, and in the Bodleian, the volumes are off-site. So, why a book of commentary addressed to an audience which is just like the commentator and has the same expectations? Commentary used once to appear between the lines and in the margins of a text. Now it's often found in the footnotes of annotated translations, which reminds me to say what a relief it is that Augustine didn't have footnotes. You can just imagine what he could have done with cross-references and what he calls another question which would take too long to discuss. But let us be thankful, he didn't. City of God is actually too big to allow much space for annotation, even if you follow Augustine's alternative suggestion of dividing it into 5 volumes, 2 of 5 books each and 3 of 4 books each. It's still noticeable if you look at annotation and commentaries that there is less said about the second half. And this used to be because the material was more familiar. Now it's because generally there's less interest in Augustine's exegesis. I remember the effect of seeing, of course, at the Patristics book display, the single volume Scholars Edition in Corpus Christianorum, a softback of the complete text, one book, not the familiar 2 volumes, which encourage mental separation of books 1 to 10 from books 11 to 22. Book technology and books as material objects attracted greater interest with the rise of the internet, when books actually ceased to be the principal way of giving information. So why a book? Why commentary as a mode of engagement with a text? Commentary is still characteristic of classicists and biblical scholars and literary scholars who work on the early centuries of a tradition. Needs a text which is of cultural importance and which needs, for its interpretation, knowledge of the language in which the text was composed and of relevant social and cultural context. Commentary has always asked what this text means, why and for whom this author is writing in this way. In the later 20th century, the same questions were asked about commentators. Why is this commentator engaging in this way with this text? Who are they? Where are they coming from? Is the envisaged audience just like the commentator, with the same general knowledge and expectations? And as technology has developed, who needs a commentary when there's so much written on all of Augustine's works, and it is so much easier to locate what has been written on a specific passage or argument or theme? And one obvious challenge to commentary is that the commentator doesn't, in practice, engage with all of the texts, but selects lemmata, literally things taken from the text, singling out a word or a group of words. Augustine could discourse at considerable length because of his training and the expectations of his hearers, and because writing and reading practices spared him physical effort. He dictated his words, trained readers presented them. Now, commentary must attend to all the text, rather than using Augustine as a dialogue partner or selecting passages to construct or support an argument. But inevitably, the commentator does select by hearing most clearly what they have themselves studied. And depending on whether that was Cicero or de Lubac, you'll get a different result. And commentators, of course, also select by envisaging an audience. Who reads City of God? How do they read it? What do they want to know in Augustinian language? What is the modus, the defining limit of a commentary? Well, in some academic cultures, the defining limit is explicit from the outset. The commentary is published as a literary or a cultural or a feminist or a social scientific commentary, perhaps in a series of that type. That gives you a stated instead of an unstated assumption that the audience shares the interests of the commentator. In most academic cultures now, it can't be assumed that readers are familiar with scripture and theology. That's just obvious. So what do students know already? What is obvious? What would they expect to look up on their phones? How do people learn? Should there be fewer words, more images? Augustine expected to speak and hear and be heard. He's noticeably more verbal than visual, though he is very sensitive to the beauty of creation. When I retired from teaching a long time ago now, I had few, if any, cultural reference in word or image in common with my ancient history students. My son says that his philosophy students now have no cultural reference in common with each other. They belong to their own tribes, which are usually defined by preferences in music. Sometimes they share their interests. What do they want to know? Well, one possible answer, I suppose, is a widely collaborative commentary, allowing allowing for different questions and perspectives and areas of expertise. Technology now would allow it to be a conversation, constantly updated, if the commentators had time. Would it be usable, even if there was consistent project funding for response to comments and queries, for the daily maintenance of servers and sites? Even if it did survive the next IT outage, would it be simply too noisy, too confusing for most users? The traditional voice of the classical commentary is the impersonal omniscient. Its purpose is to offer information on the text, not to talk about oneself and one's reactions. Vives, again, is the exception. His reformation for polemic was edited out of editions of his commentary, but he was still able to enthuse about Guillaume Mudet and Thomas More, and to confirm from personal experience Augustine's comment that some people are able to sweat at will. Vives could do that when he had tertian fever at Bruges, and his doctors were extremely surprised. Tractatio, Augustine said at the start of De Doctrina Christiana, is finding out what needs to be understood and giving it expression. What now needs to be understood? Patristics no longer assumes Augustine the towering figure, the authority whose advice was sought by officials of the empire and the church, the exceptionally learned man who must have read Seneca, must have read Prudentius. Instead, we have someone much less well-known in his own time, with great intellectual energy and argumentative skill, very good at making use of limited resources. Consider, for instance, his manipulation of what his opponents say, the signals beyond any doubt, he means. He admits. It's rather like what they are really saying is in current political discourse. Or consider the quite brilliant compression of history in Book 18, the last of the four on the course of the two cities, when Augustine has left himself one book to cover 2 millennia. First, he limits world history to the better-known traditions, namely Greece and Rome. And then he makes use of 2 books he actually had, Vero de Gente Romana and the Chronicle of Eusebius. Book 18 so much impressed one, Firmus, as a reading, that he asked for copies of all the rest. Augustine could see from subsequent letters that Firmus had read books 1 to 10, but not that he had read 11 to 22, which set out our beliefs. There is a moral here. The history of commentary shows the different purposes for which people have read City of God. To learn more about Varro on Roman religion or Porphyry on Platonism. To enlist Augustine for theological debates on grace and free will, or in support of a social and political system which would, it is thought, encourage Christian teaching on justice and virtue. But Augustine told Firmus that the fruit of De Civitate Dei was not to delight the reader or make him know much that he did not know. It was to persuade him to enter the city of God, which he could do by baptism, or to live there with perseverance, which he could do by love of righteousness. Will commentary help that purpose? Should a commentaire vraiment scientifique even attempted? Commentary close attention to texts, to what exactly the author says and why he says it like that, can remove some misleading assumptions about what Augustine meant by voluntas, about his teaching on church and state, on the kingdom of Christ, and how it is to be governed in this mortal life. Commentary can be a necessary reminder that there are other ways of thinking, other priorities. The civitas Dei accepts local rules and customs, provided they do not obstruct the worship of God. It cannot separate itself from the saeculum. But it is a different, often misunderstood and mistranslated way of envisaging a city. A truly scientific commentary does not appropriate the text. It's one voice among many. And while we are still peregrini, away from our home in heaven, we can rely on our community of colleagues to point out mistakes and omissions and to suggest different interpretations. Thank you all for your companionship.